Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Shirin Khosropour. I'm a psychology professor at ACC. I'm also director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. Tonight, we have my colleague, Dr. Mark Cunningham, who curates and runs the series, the Cinema of Conflict and Transformation series. And we also have my colleague, Janie Wang, who is a counselor at ACC. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Just a little bit about myself. I'm Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm a professor in the radio, television, and film department, teaching courses in media literacy, intro to radio, TV, and film, and intro to cinema. I have my PhD in film and media studies from the University of Texas at Austin. A long road from here that also includes 6 years in the United States Marine Corps as well. So, Janie, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Janie, and I'm one of the clinical mental health counselors here at ACC. I don't know if y'all know this, but enrolled ACC students, you actually get free mental health counseling. So if you ever have questions, feel free to ask. My undergraduate study was actually in English, and actually it was kind of funny. I was in an Asian American literature class, and that was when I first really got exposed to this film and some of these topics that growing up as a child of immigrants, I really didn't know that much about. And it obviously wasn't at that time like a very common subject matter that was taught in school in Texas. I actually grew up in Austin. This is my hometown. And so, yeah, I think kind of being exposed to that, really kind of learning more about the stuff you just didn't get in school with racial conflict, discrimination, a more robust understanding of the history of like the civil rights movement. I think that will just help me to kind of realize maybe from kind of what I'm studying in literature and these other classes, like maybe there's a way I can integrate that better. And it was actually one of my English professors is like, like maybe you could look into something where you actually work in nonprofit or in social services. And that's actually how I got connected to counseling. And, it worked out because for my field, which I later got a master's in counseling, I didn't need to be a psychology major to go into that. A lot of people don't know that. I went ahead and did my master's in counseling at Ohio State University, got dropped right into helping people, and it's just been such an amazing journey. It's such an honor, such a privilege. And so, yeah, after I finished some of my clinical hours, I came back to Texas, came back to my hometown and started working at ACC. And I've been here ever since. So that's my kind of work and educational background. I guess outside of ACC, I've worked in a university setting as well. And I've also worked in the K through 12 system providing clinical counseling. And then I did a short stint at a long-term residential treatment program for women. And that was really cool. But, it takes a special person to do that. And I'm not that person. So ACC is my place, and I'm just happy to be here to support the students.
We're here to talk about the documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin, which, for a long while was very difficult to see, actually. PBS just recently broadcast it again after a long while of it not having been seen. And because of PBS, the work that we do with them and their association with us at ACC, it made it possible for us to be able to watch it through their POV series, which has been so great. But this is a very difficult documentary, considering what happened, the injustice that we see happen in this film. In Detroit in 1982, a young man by the name of Vincent Chin was attacked by a man by the name of Ronald Evans and his stepson by the name of Michael Nitz. He was attacked and beaten with a baseball bat and killed. And nothing happened to his murderers. Nothing happened to them. And the documentary, in addition to chronicling some of the events that were happening at the time with the auto industry kind of being frozen out because of what they thought to be the Japanese imports and coming in and kind of taking over the American car industry, that having a role in Vincent Chin's murder, but also too, the film chronicles his mother's pursuit for justice for her son, and which to me, is one of the most heartbreaking parts of this film, how his mother, it's just a constant pursuit, to assure or try to assure that her son receives the justice that he deserves. And it's a heartbreaking documentary, but one that I think is so important and needs to be seen, and particularly now where we're seeing just more and more this kind of resurgence of hate crimes against Asian American people. This documentary, I think, is as important as ever for us to see and to talk about and discuss. And so I'm so happy we get to do that. And Jamie, I'm happy we get to do that with you. So let's jump right in. I want to start by asking you, after you watched the documentary, and this may seem like an obvious question, but I think it's just important because of the subject matter and because of the emotions involved. What were your general emotions right after you saw it? And what part of the films did you find to be the most difficult for you to digest as a viewer?
I think for me, I noticed that there wasn't narration. It really kind of made it feel like it really got into my head, right? Because it's almost like I'm there and it's like I'm hearing these conversations. And being Asian American myself and being the children of first generation immigrants, like I think some of the scenes they shot in like the restaurant and the community center and just kind of the ambiance and the conversations that were happening, it just felt very familiar to me. And so when you add that to the fact that then they're showing these conversations that these other people are having. I think one that really stood out to me was when they were all at that restaurant or diner and kind of just talking about how they felt about people. And it just really made it feel like I was there, almost like it's happening real time. And I think because there's no narrator happening, like someone will make a comment and then I'll be like, wait a minute, that happened so fast. Like, was that racist? Was that like a microaggression there? Like, it's all happening in real time. I really felt like I was just like walking in the footsteps of what it was like for people at that time in that city. And I think, especially because of just some of the personal connections I have with what it was like growing up in the immigrant community, it just felt like I was there. And so afterwards, that last scene with his mom just stunned, I just really felt that. She looks like my grandmother. She looks like people I grew up with. I think that there's no commentary to her response. You're just kind of left with her raw emotion. You just really feel that. I think that was really hard for me to see. There was one part where they talked about growing up, a lot of us who were children of immigrants were told, yeah, don't stand out too much. I was born in the 80s, so I can't tell if it was because of what happened that I was told don't stand out too much, be careful. Don't stand out too much because culturally you want to be modest, you don't want to like shake the table too much. You're not always perceived as an American, even though we've been here for a couple generations now, or we've gone to school here for multiple generations. My grandfather went to University of Texas, my dad went to University of Texas, and I went to University of Texas, but there was always still this fear of like, but people aren't always going to see you as belonging here. And so I think when they were talking about that, right, and enough is enough, and we want to do something to stand up for it, I could really feel the tensions of that. And then just hearing his lawyer, who was like just really dismissive, and Egan himself saying, oh, they're just want attention. Where was this before? I just felt like, wow, this is like stuck on me. It's like in my skin, it's in my hair. I feel it. I feel like I recognize these people. I feel like I know the Asian Americans who are portrayed. And I think just sitting and kind of being a fly on the wall to some of those conversations, it's like I've been that person, the only Asian or maybe even the only person of color listening to people make these comments and trying to wrestle with how do I respond. So I think just feeling a lot of like sadness, anxiety, reliving it, tension.
Interesting you talk about not standing out, right? Because I know as a Black man, as a Black person, we get told the same thing. And I think about something Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in his book, Between the World and Me. And he talks about how white people teach their children that all of the space is theirs, right? And they can roam all of it. But we, as people of color, teach our children, stay out of people's way. And again, like you say, it's a way that's making yourself smaller. So like you say, you don't stand out. But in your case, like you're talking about, as Asian Americans not being perceived as American, even though, like you say, you've been here. It's not a new thing. I very much so understand what you mean by that, for sure. But to what degree do you think that some of the more dangerous ideas in our culture, like, for example, those bumper stickers in the film, how do things like that have the power to motivate and incite real violence or real conflict in our culture?
I think that was one of the things that really haunted me for a little bit. I had to kind of really, after I watched the film, just kind of sit and reflect on, I think especially as a counselor, right? So I work with both victims of violence and perpetrators of violence. And one of the things that really haunted me while I was watching that film was when they were doing I think they were like smash-a-thons, like breaking the Asian cars. And I don't know if I saw it correctly, but like the bumper stickers were like, was it the ones with like the slanty eyes or
Yeah.
I think about how anything that makes another person or another party like less human, more other, not perceived as belonging, I think creates a lot of fertile ground for us to like further dehumanize, and to the point where we kind of reduce that other person to just an idea or just to an object. And I think that's when things get really easy then to justify violence, to justify hardening against that other person or that community. It's kind of, we can dissociate from caring, we can dissociate from empathizing, we can dissociate from compassion because we can just see them more just as these like ideas, or even in our worst kind of states, lesser than human, right? Animals. I think during the Rwanda genocide, cockroaches, right? And so I think a lot of times when we see like a violent idea, we're like, oh gosh, like I wouldn't think that, or I wouldn't be okay with that. But it's these little like degrees of dehumanizing that I think really get to us. I mean, you see that in sports teams, right? Like I went to UT, so I'll put my school under the microscope. It's like, OU sucks, right? Like who's OU? Do we ever like think about who's there? So I think seeing those images play out just really happily, like there was like a middle-aged lady just like happily like bashing that car. And it's like, wow, even bashing a car is like hard to imagine doing that. Like what was happening that like broke down her protective barriers, her sense of self, her boundaries to feel like, oh, that's like an okay thing for me to participate in. And it's really not real violence, or, oh, that slippery slope, like it doesn't really impact anybody. To answer your question, it really has the power to motivate and incite violence because it creates an atmosphere where it can be overlooked.
You said that woman and all these other people are beating this car, and they're staying in the car,
right?
But they're something else, And I think about, for my next question to you, Evans' attorney making that comment, saying that it's a quantum leap, a giant jump to say that you're angry at a Japanese import and then turn around and say you hate Asian people. And it's like, no, what did you think about that statement? Because I'm thinking like, no, dude, those things completely go together. How you just separate that? But they don't.
Yeah. And sometimes it's like hard for me to know if I'm responding as like a therapist or if I'm responding as like just myself. But I was just like, wow, the mental gymnastics that you're doing to excuse yourself from taking ownership of your feelings or your client's feelings of violence. I think what it does is it shows like how little understanding he's choosing to show he has as to where hate comes from. And we think that you have to be this horrible monster to harbor an otherness kind of perspective of someone, but a lot of times it's just enough detachment or bias or ignorance to be able to just in your mind completely like not see somebody as fully human, fully worthy of the same love, belonging, and honor that you want for yourself. So that was really jarring. And there's no narration, right? So I felt like I didn't have like my narrator security blanket. I'm just watching him say this, and you can see the expression. You can just see he's really buying into this. And it's like, wow, that's really scary. And also, wow, like how often do I do that? Just trying to justify my feelings. Like when I don't process my own tensions and turmoils and feelings appropriately, maturely, safely, I can see myself making these kinds of same blocks, keeping me from taking responsibility of how my feelings are leading to my actions, for sure.
It made me think about when I was in boot camp in the Marine Corps, and I remember some of the guys I was in the Corps with, and we would be doing exercises and stuff, and they would be completely evoking terms of like from Vietnam.
Oh,
yeah. And they would say certain things, and I'm like, dude, this is like the late 80s. We went into the 90s. Why are you still saying these terms? And like you say, those biases were passed down, and they were evoking that same type of thinking into current state of the military. And I'm thinking like, where is that coming from, right? Because you weren't even alive. I mean, they were alive, but you certainly weren't privy to like what was happening in that regard or whatever. But it's just so interesting, like you say, how that justification.
One of the things we talk about in counseling is when you overgeneralize, that can lead to a cognitive distortion. You say, oh, Japanese import to hate, that's such a leap, but Japanese import representing this whole like social, economic hot flash issue of jobs being lost, the economy, it really wasn't that long after World War II and the Vietnam War. So, long-standing, maybe inherited prejudices or discrimination and stuff. And it represents a lot. You're generalizing it now out to the people, not just the Japanese people, anyone who looks Japanese. In counseling, especially like in depression, anxiety, or violence, like that's where a lot of cognitive distortions happen. So doing it this way, you can see how like collectively as a society, a cognitive distortion is happening when you're saying oh, this is just a Japanese card, but then what does it symbolize? And then what are you saying it represents? It totally makes sense that it can lead to justifying feelings of hatred or anger.
As we know from the documentary, right, there were certain testimonies that were left out of the sentencing hearing. So I want to ask you, to what degree do you think that because the bulk of the witnesses were Black, because they worked in, they were dancers or what we call strippers or sex work, they were working in those spaces. Certainly they were poor, so classism. To what degree do you think those things affected Vincent Chin's killers being brought to justice?
Oh, I think it made a huge impact. And, I think that was just kind of the power of the film. Again, not having a narrator, you hear their perspective in the raw. It's like, how could they not take that in consideration? I thought it was really interesting that pretty much every police officer they interviewed was Black.
Right? Yeah.
And wow, you wouldn't even take their testimony. You didn't even inform them, of what was going on. I think about when the dancers were sharing their perspective and the way the judge, I'm trying to remember exactly how you put it, but you have to fit the punishment to the people, not the crime. Yeah. And it's like, what were you measuring? Yeah, it's just like I how could it not have? I don't I don't really know how to answer this intelligently. It's just like, how could it not have?
Because the bias was so obvious.
Yeah.
It was so obvious, right? And I think about that. I try to impart to my students sometimes when we're looking at certain films or we're talking about certain issues that happen, and they're looking at it from this lens now where people are certainly a lot more cognizant about certain things, and they're like, how can they not have? I said, but people did not view things like that in the 80s. Like, it's sitting there looking dead in their face. And he was like, no, we're not going to take their word for it. Like you say, and it's so funny, this the way that we talk about police, and you have these Black police officers that are like going, no, they did this. This is exactly how it happened. They beat him. They held him down. And they were like,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the filmmakers made it very obvious these are credible people. They're experts, gave them kind of like fair space to really share, their expertise or what they saw, tell their story. And it's like the film started pretty early with some of their testimony. So then to find out later, more towards the middle end, like they didn't use any of that.
Yeah.
Like that's like such a wow, that was such a huge part of like in this film understanding the story. And then to find out none of that was taken into consideration during the actual trial was just wild,
I think it's such a great move on the documentarian's part to do that, because they gave you all of this evidence, right, of what had happened. And also, too, that we learn as the documentary goes along, they literally hunted Vincent Chin down. And he was trying to get away from them and had gone into that McDonald's, right, for refuge. And they went in there after him and pulled him into the parking lot and did what they did. Like, this wasn't like crime of passion, heat of the moment, whatever. This was premeditated. They knew exactly what they were going to do. And the witnesses were telling them at every moment that they were after Chin that this is what happened, this is what was going on, and none of it did any good.
Right.
It's just hunting him down that I just was like, come on, they were unwilling to let that go and pursued him the way that they did. Also, too, at the very beginning, the neighbor, Evans and Nitz's neighbor, saying, oh, it could happen to anybody in regard to their behavior and everything that went down. Can you speak to the way that the criminal justice system has kind of failed people of color in marginalized communities? And what do you think can be done about a system that has kind of historically been created from the foundations of white supremacy? And what strategies can we use to combat those things?
I'll be honest, I think this is something I'm still learning about. And I think because I come from, an Asian American background of immigrants, I think for a long time, what I was told about the criminal justice system was heavily biased and culturally tied. So this is kind of still newer territory for me. But I was actually surprised that they had shown that neighbor kind of being like, this could have happened to anybody, because that's something we say a lot in counseling. Like, all of us are not far away from doing something that could really drastically change our lives or change someone else's life. We're only like a few risk factors away, or just enough loss of support system for any of us to be in a situation where we're making decisions that are leading to destruction. That's something we just kind of know. It helps us to stay compassionate and understanding. And I think about how, well, first of all, just like some of the history of criminal justice was first developed to basically show oppression and control over Black communities, right? And even all the way down to like runaway slaves or, things like that. Like, I think just even knowing the history of where some of our law and order comes from, I think it's just really important to be aware,
Yeah.
right? And to be aware that there might have been big biases that were part of why the safety system was created. And so that already in its origins is one way that the criminal justice system has failed people of color, and especially Black communities and marginalized communities. But I also think about how, like, in terms of where resources are being spent, when there's local governments spending more resources maybe on incarceration or in policing instead of creating in the community institutions or spaces or resources that can help lift people out of
Right.
whatever circumstances or environments that might be putting them more at risk. You see it disproportionately happening in communities of color, especially like Black urban communities and Black rural communities, right? And so I think even just in how we appropriate our resources locally on a government level, you see how that is a way that our systems have failed. I could go on, but I think about what can be done. It's interesting because I think my role as a mental health counselor, being embedded into a system, is part of a strategy. It's like making resources available. And it's also like choosing to allocate resources in that way, right? And so it's amazing how much we hear mostly on the news about like the national politics and voting for national things, but who you vote for on a local level, all the way down to the school board, which I think right now we're kind of seeing play out, makes a huge difference how resources get allocated, whose voices are elevated and amplified. And so, I think being proactive and mindful and aware of what's even happening locally can make a huge difference in not only changing maybe what the system looks like locally, but then having like a radiating effect on the communities around us. I think acknowledging the history, like I said, acknowledging the communities that have been hurt. So coming from a counseling perspective, I think one of the sticky issues is when someone's suicidal or someone's homicidal, a lot of people automatically call the police. But if you're working, to serve a community where the police have historically maybe not been seen as safe or not been seen as caring for your community, that can be a real breach in trust, right? And a lot of times, I have to kind of be very gentle and careful when I'm talking about what to do if I think you're in danger, and making sure I'm respectful of how the other person in front of me's experiences are with the criminal justice system or their family or their community. And so it's probably also like just really listening to the person in front of you and not assuming that the criminal justice system is safe to them. I mean, I remember, even growing up for me as an Asian American, like my parents being like, if something happens to you, you can call the police, but we just don't know if they're going to care, So not assuming that, someone else's experience or perspective until you've actually listened. And I just feel like I don't know, it sounds kind of kumbaya, but like really listening to each other really could make a huge difference in how we respond to these kinds of things that need reform.
I had another question to ask you about something the judge said, but based on what you just talked about, what you're saying about calling the police and whether they really care or not, I think I should ask this question next. Part of the reason the appeal for the civil rights trial, Vincent Chin's mother did a civil rights trial after the fact, after she didn't get justice the first time, she tries again. And in 1987, it failed, right? Because many people found it difficult to believe that Asian American people even experience discrimination, let alone racial violence. Why do you think that's the case? And do you think people still think that way about the way these kind of issues of discrimination affect people who are Asian American?
I definitely think it still happens. And I think there's a lot of reason why it happened. I think a big part is, different ways of Asian immigration came to pursue economic opportunity in the United States. And there were different pathways for that. I think the earliest was working in labor camps or the railroads, later through education. And so I think there's this false perception, right, that, because they're highly educated or they really pursue education, like everything is fine for them then, oh, they're going to tech fields. I think Vincent Chin himself was an engineer and
Yeah.
represented that kind of new wave of Asians that were coming. Well, he's rich, or he's going to be rich, or he's going to make a lot of money. And so like they should be fine, if they can do this, that they can handle things, or it doesn't seem like they have any problems. And I think there's also cultural pieces, right? If you come from a culture where going against authority is not always culturally sanctioned, or you come from a culture where it's shame-based. And so if you do something that might shame your family or shame your community, you're not maybe as likely to stick your neck out or confront someone or challenge someone. So they might be perceived as like docile or obedient. I think I've heard that word described. Yeah, I definitely think there was like, because people were worried for their ability to advance economically or be safe or not be picked on or not be further ostracized, it kind of gave the impression maybe to people that it's okay to assume Asians are okay. I think it's also just, there's this sense that like as an Asian over centuries of immigration, that they're always going to be considered other, right? They're not 100% full class citizens because you look different, because you might still have ties to your ancestors' language, because there are these enclaves like Chinatown that were created because people were being violently attacked. So they created Chinatowns and stuff to be safe, and so like, oh, these people are fine. So I think those are some key pieces, a lot of underreporting of violence, a lot of just being dismissed as this didn't happen. I definitely think it's still happening today. There's research, on how far do people advance in their fields and in their careers. And there's a lot of evidence that shows even now Asian Americans are still hitting barriers. They call it the bamboo ceiling. They're hitting barriers to leadership and roles that allow them to do decision making. But I think the other thing that maybe is part of this is that a lot of people see Asian Americans as this monolith, but Asian Americans is like this huge group, right? And as a Chinese American, I know most people, when they think of Asian American, they think of someone like me coming from China or a family coming from China. But we have people that are from Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, very different histories and very different reasons for coming to the United States. And actually, non-Chinese, non-Eastern Asian Americans actually have some of the highest rates of poverty, some of the highest rates of healthcare issues, lowest access to mental health and healthcare resources than other populations in the United States, but they're kind of being erased in this term that doesn't show all these differences between these communities and these people groups. A lot of people don't realize when people came as refugees, that's a very different experience than when my parents came as graduate students. So there's this kind of erasure that happens when we use this term that really doesn't capture all the differences. Even as a Chinese American, my parents were born in Taiwan, but were ethnically Chinese. My grandparents fought the communists, right? And so, I think when I hear things like, you're Chinese, you must be communist, like, no, like my family died to like fight, in that war. That really doesn't represent my history. And so not knowing the history, not really making teaching Asian American history or even just world history a priority in our education system, I think contributes to that too.
I want to extend on something that you mentioned about, Vincent Chin was attacked and murdered on the eve of his wedding day. Like, he was to be married and was at a bachelor party at this club and kind of really operating in a space that is not how we always consider stereotypically read Asian people: quiet, demure, don't say anything. He was giving these guys like what for, going back and forth with them and seeing stereotypically reading Asian people one way, right? And Vincent Chin acting the opposite. To what degree do you think that contributed not only to his murder, but to the way that he would ultimately not receive justice for what had happened to him?
That's the other thing too, is like, really up to that point, any kind of exposure people had to like Asian representation in media was like highly negative. You were either like seeing people play these like dragon women who were like femme fatales who were going to poison you at any moment, right? Or unfortunately as like sexualized objects. I think a lot of Vietnam War movies that came out, or even again going back to the dragon lady, highly sexualized, again dehumanized kind of roles, or as these like
in Breakfast at Tiffany's, you get something like that.
Oh yeah, like yellow face.
Yellowface.
I was gonna say these like either like kung fu masters who don't speak English. You just did not have anything in the media that like really portrayed Asians respectfully or like even anywhere close to like what population is like at
Right.
that time. And people have these stereotypes. I actually remember when I worked in a middle school and I was helping with one of the classrooms, kind of introducing myself to the students that I might be seeing counseling. And one of them literally held up, like, I guess Lucy Liu was in Charlie's Angels or something at the time and was like pointing at it. It was like, is that you? And I was like, no, that's not me, you know? I think to realize that Vincent was a real person who was capable of being angry, who could fight back. I think he himself was also a military
Yeah.
veteran. They were both military vet. He could fight back. He could be assertive. He could be found at a strip club. You know, like I just imagine that whole interaction like became really threatening, you know, to Ian and his party. And we go into fight or flight. And I just imagine that really contributed to him not being able to like make decisions
Right.
because he wasn't prepared to confront with a real person.
And not that the fight was fair anyway. I mean, you know,
Right.
he was completely kind of caught off guard in that way. But I thought that was really, really interesting because I was watching it. It wasn't this model Asian.
Right.
You know, he was smart and all this other stuff, right? But he was, like you said, I love how you put a real person, right? That would get into it with somebody, that would be angry with somebody. That, hey, I really don't like the way you're talking, but I'm gonna do something about it too.
Absolutely. And reportedly, Vincent Chin's last words before he died was, "It's not fair." I think what's so haunting about that, it just kind of captures like this awareness of like, it's gamed against me, you know, and I can't be real. I can't be myself. I can't truly be accepted as a true American. I can't be allowed to like feel like I have to defend myself or to make a mistake. I'm not allowed to do any of that. I have to be perfect.
So how can we better inform society about who Asian Americans are and the long history of anti-Asian racism in the United States? I mean, I know you already mentioned like speaking face to face and awareness and education, but aside from those things, what other things can be done to better inform society about who Asian American people are?
Yeah, so I think about like within your own sphere and then with like the bigger sphere. And then even within that, there's like different degrees. I think generally telling Asian American stories, especially with Asian American history in the United States, I think that's really important. Making sure that the different platforms and the different media spaces, I mean, storytelling is so important, right? And representation in those media spaces are so important. Really bring those stories to the forefront. And I think letting Asian Americans tell those stories, I think that's really important too. I think making sure that in decision-making spaces, there's representation in those spaces of the Asian American perspective. There's politically like making sure that like not just voting for informed candidates that might represent, you know, different Asian American populations, but I think also just like making sure resources are allocated, right, into supporting Asian American community centers or neighborhoods, you know, fully recognizing them as equal citizens. I've seen that there's some school districts and states that are now going to implement an Asian American history curriculum, and that's amazing. You know, there's just a lot there kind of education wise that can happen. I think these films are incredibly important. So there's actually a really great Asian American Film Festival that happens in Austin, and it's really fun. And you get to see some amazing films by Asian writers and content creators. Making sure that, you know, when we're using a product or there's like a food that might have Asian American origins or Asian origins, like properly crediting that instead of stealing it for our own uses or for our own kind of economic gain, not kind of culturally appropriate, you know, traditions and histories and stories and art and technology, you know, from Asian Americans. But I think from like a personal level too, it's just entering that world a little bit. If you order takeout, maybe actually sitting and eating in the restaurant and getting to know, you know, the waiters and the restaurant owners and finding out their stories. I think volunteering a little bit in the community centers. There's the Austin Asian American Resource Center. They do a lot of really cool things. They do like a market night. You can go and learn what it's like to step in someone else's shoes, right? You know, doing your own reading, do your own listening to stories and sharing it with other people. But I think also just really listening to your friends or classmates or professors who are Asian American and really asking them for their perspective, believing their perspective, and not just immediately dismissing or just seeing it from your own lens or your own experience. I mean, I think even for me, just making sure that I'm always reminding people Asian American is not a monolith. There's a lot of people in this category that I'm still learning from. And my face does not represent everyone that we try to serve when we talk about the Asian American community. community.
I love that you also, among all of these really great ways, brought up education. And I think one other way we really need to make sure happens at all levels of education is that as we are teaching children and then in higher ed, adults about American history and American literature and American whatever, that we include Asian Americans in all of that. And it's not just the white American history and white American literature and all of that. And it's not just a token. Okay, now we're going to look at this. It's just a part of our country. It's not, okay, now we did American. Now we're going to look at Chinese American or Asian American, right? That's what we're trying to do in our courses at ACC. And also, like in my own courses in psychology, psychology is really the study done by mostly white Western men about populations that are what we call weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed. Bring in, I mean, there's research done all over the globe in psychology, but it doesn't make its way into our textbooks. So whatever we're teaching, like making sure that it's representative of the world's population, not just the ones who have the most power and access to doing this kind of work.
Excellent. Absolutely. In extension of that, Asian American activists in particular have kind of built these kind of multiracial coalitions to fight the unjust criminal justice system. So why do you think, Jenny, that a coalition building is such a powerful tool when protesting for equity and civil rights? And what do you think are the best practices and what kind of mindset should we have in order to stay unified around this struggle for civil rights?
One very, I think, practical reason for coalition building is that you can learn from each other and you can learn from each other's attempts and histories and benefit from that shared knowledge and shared resources. And I come from a culture where honor is really important. And I think there's a sense in when I kind of hear about the coalition building that happened with Vincent Chin is I think there's a part of me that also just feels like it's just so important to honor who's come before us. And, I don't know if a lot of you knew this, but some of the first civil rights cases that successfully went through court had Asian plaintiffs, but a lot of them were successfully pushed to court because Black and African-American civil rights activists really came along those cases and really showed Asian communities how to fight for rights and fight for representation. It was because the Black community actually helped. And, I think as an Asian American, I always want to make sure I remember that and that I honor, instead of having a scarcity principle and a scarcity mindset, the Black community always had a sharing, abundance, and we're brothers and sisters in this together, in this fight for equality together kind of mindset. My family and I'm very much indebted to that. And so I think, what do we benefit from that? We benefit from each other's experiences. We have an opportunity to have a posture of learning from people who've gone before us, just more people working on the same thing together. It's kind of like whichever person or whichever community is suffering makes all of us suffer. And so wanting to lift up any community because that's going to impact us, right? And I think just the very nature of coalition building, it's very much practicing what we're saying we want to see happen. We want to see people being honored, respected, identified as equals. And that's the very nature of how you build a coalition. You see each other as equal partners and people you can learn mutually from. It really builds that culture. I'm sure there's really practical reasons too, but I think about just what it means that we belong together in this, I think makes a big difference.
That's why it's so disheartening for me sometimes to see Black and Asian communities or Black and Latino communities in discord so much because we have so much in common. There's some commonalities between our struggle, and it just sometimes I think, like you said, that gets forgotten. So much gets lost in that, and we end up separating when in actuality, more coalition building is to combat some of these things that are happening.
Yeah, because I just think about at the end of the day, our enemy is systems of oppression, right? And you just never know when that system of oppression could come from you. So no one's excused from it, no one's excluded, no one's safe from that. Until a system of oppression is demolished, no one is safe from that. Just kind of being sober-minded about that together.
Sure, definitely. So I have one more question for you before I open it up to see if anybody else has any questions or some comments. This is gonna sound weird. Hopefully it doesn't. I hope you get what I'm saying with this. But who or what do you think ended up really killing Vincent Chin?
Oh man. I mean, it's kind of tricky, because Michael was the one that held him in the bear hug and Ronald was the one that attacked with a baseball bat, but I think it's in a documentary, Michael was the one that gave him the baseball bat, right? And so I think it just shows like even then, like, who gets tried and sent to court is already really tricky. They're the ones who perpetrated the physical act of violence, but I think lots of people were complicit in creating a culture of violence against someone like Vincent Chin. I mean, I just think about the campaigns to smash cars, and the bumper stickers with the slanty eyes, or I think even now, like the talk against like manufacturers in China, they're stealing our jobs. That's still creating, this language of hostility that makes violence more tolerable. I think about the biases in the criminal justice system, the way that the gaslighting that was happening, they were like, this is all just the media spinning it. And they're like, no, this is actually the media actually doing investigative journalism, right? I mean, there's so many parts to this. And the judge, I read that he was a previous prisoner of war in Asia. And so did not play a role. We don't know. And so I think because there's so many people and communities and parts and organizations and institutions that had a hand in this, I think that's a reminder for all of us that we have to be very careful to make sure we are also not inadvertently a hand in violence against someone or a community just because we are turning a blind eye or just because we're like, oh, they're nice neighbors when they're calm and not threatened, that we're not also inadvertently contributing to creating incredible violence against somebody.
True. Wow. So I want to open the floor to questions from our audience. Anything you want to ask? Some clarification on? Okay, Renee.
It's not really a question, but it's just more so a comment. But, as I was watching the documentary, I made a connection between like the Asian hate crimes that were happening last year and through 2020 and Vincent Chin's situation where Asian Americans who have absolutely nothing to do with certain issues that are prevalent in the world are being blamed and harmed for things that have literally nothing to do with them, things that aren't their own doing in any way. So yeah, I just found it very unfortunate. And just the way that Asian Americans have their American identity just stripped off. They aren't considered to be an integrated part of the country.
Yeah, that's a really good point, particularly with COVID. We saw that happen. Such an increase in Asian hate crimes happened because of COVID and because of the way that was presented to us in the media. What are your thoughts on that, Janie? That's a good point. Thanks.
Yeah, it kind of made me also think about the Atlanta shootings, when the shooter was like, well, I think he had his own kind of delusions and paranoia and just kind of associating sexual temptation to the massage parlor. And so kind of justifying his mind, like, I'm going to take out the threat. And just how it's just too easy to make these false connections between a people group and what's causing suffering or what's causing tensions for you. When they were reporting on the violence against Asians, unfortunately, they were focusing in the media too. They were also focusing on perpetrators that happened to be Black, and just really creating this unnecessary false kind of like racial hostility or divide in the media that wasn't actually in the stats. Most of the perpetrators of those crimes were not Black, but the ones that always got reported were Black perpetrators. And so, I think one of the systemic things we talked about, how do we bring changes of is holding our media accountable. So this is like an example. My brother, his favorite thing to do was to write letters to the editor. And of course, my parents being Asian immigrants are like, don't do that. They're going to come and like find you because they put your name. But he like really saw it as something that was important, that he would confront the newspaper or the Daily Texan and be like, hey, what you printed was wrong, and do we hold these sources of information accountable? Now journalism, where a lot of people can represent a lot of different things, do we hold all those other things accountable? Do we hold social media accountable for that kind of misinformation? And then being good consumers to being thoughtful consumers of what we choose to believe. Because you could very clearly tell that there was a bias that was being presented on showing who was perpetrating these crimes when it really wasn't true.
Interesting you mentioned, I've had friends of mine who are Asian that would post things on their Instagram pages, and they were focusing specifically, like you said, on the attacks on Asian Americans from people who were Black, right? And then they kind of use it as this is why I'm voting for this person. And it's like, oh my God, and it was like trying to untangle all of that, right? And have conversations about it, and everybody's emotions are high, right? Because of what's going on. But you're absolutely right. The way that those attacks were centered. I even think about, like you mentioned, the massage parlors, the way they reconcile that by saying, oh, no, it was they were random attacks. It was clearly connected. kind of the way, you're right, the media presents things in this way, right? That really does, again, much like those bumper stickers, much like that beating of the car in the Vincent Chin documentary, it really is shaping people's attitudes and behaviors and ways of thinking about things.
Mark, what you said about your Asian friends themselves kind of posting about crimes committed by Black people against them. It's just that what happens in societies where there is a dominant group and then there's several oppressed groups, because it turns us against each other. I'm technically Asian. I'm from Iran. Iran is in Asia, but I see a lot of bias against East Asians in my own Iranian community. I also wanted to say this film interested me in researching to see what's happened, because it's been 40 years. And so PBS has some other programming about this. And in one of the programs, they talked about how there have been, since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been a 70% increase in incidents reported against Asians. There have been 11,000. And we know that because in the early 90s, the Hate Crimes Act was passed. So government required that people keep track. It's not a really perfect system because people don't want to record things as hate crimes. But I wonder, Janie, what do you think if the Hate Crimes Act had been passed? Because part of it is to keep statistics, and then a few years later, they added some penalty to the punishment if it deems to be a Hate Crimes Act. Do you think if we had the Hate Crimes Act, the outcome of these trials would have been different?
That's hard to say. There probably would have been some differences, but I also just feel like with the Vincent Chin murder, it was just like a new generation of Asian activists to emerge. And so, I feel like a difference would have had to happen if there was already like a level of activism or a level of political and media presence, to hold people accountable and take it seriously. I don't know. I don't know if I'm just being a realist or what, but
No, I think you're right. I think the reason we didn't have the Hate Crimes Act then is because the country wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
And I think it just shows you can change policy as much as you want, but you also have to change the culture, right? And we've had some policy changes that are meant to protect equal rights or meant to protect and prevent discrimination, but still hasn't removed the hidden ways that those hostilities and violence perpetuate and continue and are sustained. Just because there's laws doesn't mean that our society has changed. And I really think that that's up to us.
Yeah, I feel like I call it cynicism, but I feel like it's very difficult to change people's minds about certain things. Like, people believe what they want to believe. And I'm not saying it's not impossible. You can do it. It can be done. But this way, that people have to want to do it. I think about it as a professor, the information I'm presenting to students or whatever else, you hope that information sticks and gets them to thinking about things differently. And that's what, like you say, to kind of move the needle to some solutions to what's happening.
I wish I had come just a little bit more scholastically prepared for this, but one of the things that y'all can look into that I think is really interesting, there's been some new research that's been done on bias untraining, helping communities or people who've historically kind of represented certain biases, especially racial biases, how to untrain them. A lot of work on former white supremacists. How have you de-radicalized? Or there's a lot of kind of interesting research that's out there. But one thing that is a common thread in all of like the interventions that they research is that at the end of the day, what changes somebody's view or ability to behold somebody else as worthy and belonging is being connected in life and really interacting with that person as a person. And I think it kind of brings us back to the original topic, like when we dehumanize, when we think other people's other, we do this with social media too. We think, oh, we're behind a screen, I can just do this, I can dissociate. But even in counseling, to heal, to work through trauma, to really kind of be able to move past anxiety or depression, you have to be present. You have to be engaged, you have to be grounded. And I think there's something that seems to be emerging in the research that it's the same way in our relationships. And actually, Renee Brown, who's a shame researcher, has written a couple books that kind of talk about polarization as connects with shame. And there's one called Braving the Wilderness that talks more in depth about how do we check our own hearts to make sure we're not perpetuating this tribalism or this kind of otherness that we see really showing up in our societies right now.
Being the person that's in a marginalized culture, or being those of us who are people of color, whatever, and being constantly told too that what we're pointing out is not valid. That's not real, as we're using it as some type of crutch or some type of go-to to not do this work that we're clearly doing, to not engage in the culture in the ways that we're clearly trying to do. And it's disheartening, and it's exhausting and frustrating. I feel that sometimes as a professor. I think that when I'm teaching my students about things and I'm talking about issues dealing with Black people or any other marginalized group that I talk about, and I feel like, is what I'm seeing on their face, is this telling me that they don't want to hear it?
Mm.
Should I talk about this or should I not say this? Should I assign these movies? Should I not assign these movies? It's such a balance in that, to kind of think about those things.
Yeah. I think as an encouragement to all of y'all here who feel, the weight of Dr. Cunningham's words, you just like, I'm tired, or it just feels like this is like tiring work. Something that has really helped me is to remember this is not work that you do alone, right? That coalition, that community, there's lots of other people also working towards this. There's lots of ways to connect with each other and find those people, but also to remember that there's different ways to do this work in different seasons. And maybe right now, some of us are in the activism season, and maybe some of us are in the storytelling season, and maybe some of us are in the counseling season, and maybe some of us are in the, I'm going to like parent well so that I don't pass on biases or trauma season. All of that work is just as important to really like be in a hospitality season of that. I think about like, I've seen racism in my own like family as well towards people of other races or ethnicities, and gosh, I just think about how like the Black community could have said, no, we don't want to help you with this anymore, you've burned us too many times, but they were generous and hospitable in that. Like hospitality is a huge part of the work as well, to make safe spaces, to be curious, and so not to be overwhelmed or to lose hope because you can't do all of it at the same time. That's okay, we're not meant to. If we're all just doing what we can with what we have to be people who are, again, present, grounded, and willing to engage, a lot can happen. And, if we first start with just this group, ACC as a college, that's still a lot of people that are impacted.
I'm trying not to tear up. No, seriously, because I felt that. I really felt what you just said. I really did.
Yeah, maybe that just comes from my own hope. In my work, I only meet with students one-on-one. I never really know, like, optimally, like how much difference am I really making, right? But fortunately, that's not how humanity works. And I'm sure all of you can think of that one person that maybe you didn't know very well or interact even that much with that really changed you and set you on a different course, maybe encouraged you to come back to school. Maybe that one professor who I was just so excited that we were hosting this film because it is hard to find. I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to do a Vincent Chin film. That's amazing, And so we all radiate out. There's just something even metaphysically like kind of amazing about how people work. And I think to trust that.
In our last kind of few minutes here, I'd like to end talking about Vincent Chin's mother a little, who's so affecting in this documentary. And I just think about, again, the older I get, I'm turning into a crybaby, but it's just that scene, her at the end when nothing still happens and she takes those long pauses and she just doesn't say anything. She's like rendered speechless by this injustice. And when she finally does speak, it's asking for the fight to continue, to ask in so many words for her son's life not be in vain, for us to continue fighting. What do you think it meant for Vincent Chin's mother as an immigrant, thinking that America is this space, right, where this is not what she intended for her child, that something different was supposed to happen in this space, and then for this to be the result? How did you read Mom watching her?
I mean, she's such an incredibly brave, courageous woman and tough, tenacious. And I think for her to be so vulnerable, I don't know if part of this because I come from a similar cultural background. It's like, wow, for her to be that vulnerable, for her to fight what seems like is going to be a losing fight, but not to be ashamed, to really declare this is like important and good and honorable and worth it. It was really powerful. And just her pain, like her willingness to show it, right? And to appeal or try a different tactic. And I mean, wow, like one could say a mother's love, but I really think it just also says something about her and how she cares for justice and how she cares for making sure America doesn't stay the same. It just felt like I was watching my own relatives. And I remember when during the 2020 election, there was a lot of chatter going on in some of the Asian social media accounts that if Trump loses, they're going to come for us. And I remember my mom, who's been part of this country since 1982, just randomly showing up to my door. I'm a full grown mom myself, showing up to my house with Chinese brown dumplings, just with dumplings, and being like, hey, I made food for you so you don't have to go outside because you want to be safe. Don't go outside. Be careful. Something might happen. And I just remember, man, she's been in this country for so long. My parents, started a small business, a small consulting firm, and always made a point to hire immigrants. They came and they're so grateful and they started their lives here. And after like 40 years, my mom is like showing up at my door with food. And she's like, just in case it gets dangerous, you don't have to go out. I just want you to be safe. And I think that just broke my heart. Like, wow, as a mom, that you have to worry about that. And I know that doesn't even compare with other people in other communities. I think some of my friends who are Black parents, I know that compares nothing to what it's like for that. But I think to see Vincent Chin's mom like square with that and not be backed down, that was just amazing. And I think amazing for me to see, and I think amazing for everyone to see. Like, you don't have to back down from injustice. You don't have to back down from horror. You can still fight. And even if your court effort doesn't make it, other people are going to be impacted and possibly keep moving forward.
Vincent Chin is his mother's child, right? I mean, she also too, right, kind of works against that stereotypical reading of Asian women, right? That she's very vocal and, like you said, very outspoken and very adamant that her son receive justice. And you're right, she doesn't back down. That's so important to see on so many levels. We could say absolutely, right, a mother's love, like you said, but it is bigger than that. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah, I think about like there were some interviews where they're saying, oh, they're just trying to get attention, or I think maybe even in his lawyers. I was like, yeah, that's like how like your brain could not process that this Asian mom would fight back, right? Like your brain could not even make space for the fact that this Asian mom was like, I'm gonna come and get all this legal help and the community is gonna rally around me. That the only way you can conceptualize is like they're just looking for attention instead of like, no, they're here to bring change. And yeah, she really endured.
She stands out most to me in the documentary. I don't know how others of you feel, but she just really struck me to see her do that, because I knew what it must have taken for her to do that. And she's doing it alone, seemingly, and standing there. I mean, of course, right, she has support of the people who are supporting her and lifting her up in that way, but she is taking this stand, and doing that for her child. It's just amazing to see. It really, really is. Wow. Well, Janie, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great. I've really learned a lot from you, and really am going to take to heart what you said about what season am I in, instead of leaning on frustration and exhaustion, but to kind of work from that space as I continue to find solutions and continue to talk about, marginalized spaces in this country. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for having me here and giving me a chance to talk about my response to this story. And I come from a vocational world where a lot of what I do is individual work, and just really seeing if even just our own hearts deepen with compassion for one another, what a difference that makes in our own lives, but in the lives of people around us. And I really hope that this story, inspires you to be courageous and know that you're worthy of people fighting for you too.